Welcome to People in Innovation, a CPI podcast. From groundbreaking discoveries to the challenges behind the breakthroughs, we shine a light on the people behind the innovations shaping our future. I'm Steve Bagshaw, Chair of the High Value Manufacturing Catapult, and your host for this Engineering Biology podcast series. Across this series, we've explored what engineering biology is, how it works, and what it takes to scale innovations from the lab into industry. In this final episode, we're focusing on growth, how engineering biology becomes business, and how ecosystems turn innovation into jobs, productivity, and economic resilience. We'll be using the Bio-Industrial Cluster North as a real-world example of that ecosystem thinking in action. And to do that, I'm joined by Tracey Taylor Preston, who is the Sector Development Relationship Manager for Invest in York and North Yorkshire, and Sophie Walton, who is the Director of Strategic Partnerships at CPI. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you both to introduce yourselves and share how your work connects engineering biology to growth and opportunity. Sophie, would you start for us, please?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Sophie. I'm a biotechnologist by background, but it feels quite a long time ago, I guess, that they let me loose in the lab actually on the equipment, although I still get quite excited if you put me near big stainless steel fermenters. But my real interest, I guess, is how you convert some of that science and tech and some of that really cool stuff that we see come up through into real impact, real products that we're exporting. And that's what really sort of gets me going and gets me up in the morning to go to work. So that's me.
Certainly my background's from industry. So I spent 35 years in food and drink industry as well as into genetics. I more recently came to work for Combined Authority or part of local government. And part of my role is to develop growth in the region and look at growth strategies. One of our high skill sets within the region is engineering biology at the University of York, and it's how we can connect that as part of the government strategy to the rest of the region to drive growth.
Brilliant. Let's start at the beginning, if you don't mind. When people talk about the bioeconomy, Sophie, what do they mean?
Well, that's a good question, isn't it? I think one of the things about the bioeconomy and one of the reasons that it's so exciting is because it is such a broad, a broad set of products, a broad set of different technologies that we use to get there. And I think I always bring it back to the two that everybody loves, which is beer and cheese. What's not to like about beer and cheese? They've been around forever, but they are products of the bioeconomy. And we tend, don't we, to always think about the really high-tech bits, especially if you come from a technical background. You think about really advanced medicines and all this, but realistically, the products of the bioeconomy all around us. They're in our homes, everywhere you look. They're in laundry and cosmetics, beer, wine, cheese. They're in our fridges, and they've got such a big potential as well. I think I read somewhere that soon we're going to have about 60% of our materials and our fuels coming from products of the bioeconomy, which is massive. So they're all around us, and it's a huge opportunity for growth. You know, we're already amazing at it in the UK, really, really, really strong in the UK. And it's just a really good opportunity to start pulling stuff out of our universities. Our universities are some of the best in the world at starting up, particularly in the biotech area. I think we've started up the most biotech businesses in the UK out the whole of Europe. We tend to talk ourselves down, don't we, in the UK? But we're actually really good at starting up businesses, and particularly the biotech space. But where we need to get better is pulling that through and actually getting them manufactured here. And that's what excites me about the bioeconomy is we're already really good at it and we've got a really strong foundation. But there's the ability for us to leverage that and do so much more, particularly in the chemicals and materials space, I think.
Yeah, I think that's really, your points are really well made there. And I think, Tracey, when you look at this from the position that you're talking about, getting people to come and invest in the region, how do you describe the ecosystem that's needed? And why do bioeconomy innovations need an ecosystem?
I think to start with, I'm not often dealing with people with a science background. So when I first start describing a bioeconomy, I say, well, the world's current economy is driven by fossil fuels. So 96% of everything that we use and touch and every day is made from fossil fuels. Therefore, the bioeconomy is using plants and other organisms to change that. So I have to start with the basics because I'm not always speaking to scientists that know about what they're talking about. In terms of an ecosystem, I think, as Sophie said, it's because it is so broad brush and because it covers everything from energy through to advanced materials, through to drugs, through to crops and crop science. It is such a broad type of science that you need a wider ecosystem, that if you've developed an idea, you need to have a wide range of people that you can contact and allow you to access the whole of the UK's ecosystem often, because the part of expertise that you or your business would need may not necessarily be local.
So that brings us to the bioindustrial cluster north, because in a way, both of you have been instrumental in getting this off the ground. Sophie, why does it make a difference? Why is it a good idea to have a cluster like this, a regional-based cluster, especially as Tracey's saying, there's a national interest here too.
Yeah, and I think what Tracey said about all of those different components of the ecosystem being really critical. And for me, it's about that multidisciplinarity and how we all coming together to provide different bits of skill set. I think one of the common things that we hear from industry all the time is that skill set is really fragmented in the UK. So you can go over here for a little bit of tech or skills here, and then you have to go somewhere else. You have to find it all. You have to piece it all together yourself. So I think one of the things that CPI has been wanting to do for a long time is really act as a convener, and we've done that. We do that really, really well in collaborative projects. So we form these big consortium projects. But this is about, can we create a device that endures beyond any single project, which really pulls that ecosystem together and pulls universities, and we've got the University of York and Teesside providing that really applied research and some really excellent expertise in areas like green chemistry and biotech, and pairing them up with some of the sort of translational capabilities of CPI and BDC. And that translational capability in itself is a pooling of lots of different expertise, and that's what makes it tricky, right? Scale-up's really tricky, and it's because you're bringing together kind of chemical engineering with biotech, with microbiology, with fermentation, with chemistry. You've got to pool all that together and have the research understanding and the manufacturing understanding together. And then you're tying that really uniquely, I think, into some of the capabilities of the Pioneer Group, with their really high quality incubation sort of space and piloting space that they've got at Walton Centre. Walton Centre is a golden kind of asset for the UK in terms of, that ability to really quickly pilot and scale up industrial processes and products. And then you've got the free port and the deep sea port just right there at the back. And what we're trying to create is that really seamless flow right from the universities all the way up into export and manufacture in the Tees Valley. I think there's something about pace as well. I think if I look at technology development, we're just taking too long to do it. And that's partially because companies are having to navigate that really complex sort of mechanics that we've set up in the UK, rather than it being providing a seamless flow for them. And I think the other thing that we're trying to really strongly bring in is that sort of VC funding and the public-private funding needed to pull these technologies through rapidly. And we need to get quicker in the UK. We need to get slicker in the UK. Otherwise, we just see these technologies so often being bought and taken overseas when it's us that's invented them. We created them, and then we're seeing them taken overseas, and we need to try to create that stickiness in the UK through devices like Bioindustrial Cluster North.
Brilliant. And Tracey, when you look at it from south of the region, if you like, in the York and North Yorkshire, anything that you would add to what Sophie said there in terms of what you think out of the bio industrial cluster north, in terms of what it brings to the region?
From my perspective, it sort of regenerates a system that was already there with the old ICI. If we think of York and North Yorkshire, we probably think of Harrogate and the work that ICI Harrogate did in terms of new materials at the time. And ICI, which is the site where one today, was the original chemical industry. So the regeneration of that, and also that people travel across regional boundaries. We're so adjacent is that lots of people that live in my area could work in the chemical industry and those types of industries in Teesside. So it's got the heritage, but also we've also got the system connectivity through the TRLs. So we have the Biorenewables Development Centre, which is probably the first stage that businesses would go to look at translational, translating their idea into something that would make sense and would then transfer over to CPI. So we've got the connected ecosystems. We also have the feedstocks within our region. The bioeconomy has been long established with Bio Yorkshire in the York and North Yorkshire region. So we've got quite an evolved system that looks at feedstocks and works quite closely with agriculture in the region.
Just adding a little to what Tracey said as well, I think we've got a really nice example and one that we want to do more of, which is a little company called Exotic Technologies. So that was a UK university spin out. So I think it spun out originally of Nottingham University. And it's a really cool technology. It's an agri-tech product that you spray on crops, and it helps plants to grab nitrogen from the atmosphere, and you need less traditional nitrogen fertilizers for them to grow big and strong and get more productivity out of your land. And they relocated to York to be close to York University and to be incubated at the BDC. And now they're pilot manufacturing up at Walton Centre, and they're starting to export all around the world. So that's a really nice exemplar for me of how we can do that UK university spin out with a really cool technology, and actually we can put it all the way through into export. I think that's really exciting. That for me is what we want to achieve loads more of. You know.
I think Exotic's a great example, and a really good advert also for one of the previous episodes of this series where we had Exotic actually presenting on here. And it's, I think you're absolutely right. It's talking about what we're talking about today, which is how you can work regionally and how you create an ecosystem. I think they're a great example.
Just to add to that, I think what Exotics also do is they highlight the gap in funding in the UK. So Exotics are now owned by a Canadian business. So it was genuinely UKRI funded, taxpayer funded, really an advanced product that's actually been snapped up by other countries because they've got better seed funding rounds and ways of approaching that. So that whilst it's a strength of our region, it also is an exemplar of the things that we should be doing better as well.
Oh, that's a great point. Thanks for making it. And the perhaps one of the things we'll perhaps come back to are things that are missing as you stitch the ecosystem together. What is it that we need more of? But before we get there, I'm really interested in just exploring collaboration a little bit more, because one of the things that strikes me about the Bioindustrial Cluster North is that it's a little unusual, and that because you've got two combined authorities involved here, Tees Valley Combined Authority and York and North Yorkshire, you don't get the natural boundary that you get when you work in one region. And I wondered if both of you could comment on whether you see that as a weakness or a strength for the cluster.
There will always be challenges. I mean, we've got to balance ultimately what each region is measured on is economic growth. Economic growth rarely sits within boundaries, though, and people don't always work where they live. So it's one of those greater understandings. We've had a similar type of challenge in terms of we've got a great concept in York and North Yorkshire at the moment that's got some mayoral funding. However, the next stage of it has to go to CPI. So there are always going to be challenges that, we've got one region funding another region.
One of the things we've been talking about is how the ecosystem works, Tracey, and it strikes me as being interesting in this bioindustrial cluster north that it's across two regions, two combined authorities. I wondered whether that causes us any problems in terms of how sometimes we work regionally. Do you have any thoughts on that from where you sit?
I think probably from a CA perspective, we're very much measured on driving the economy and delivering jobs for our region. However, saying that, it's about enabling people within our region to gain high value, better jobs. So, and as I said, the two regions are so connected. We've got York and North Yorkshire is the largest region in the whole of the UK as a combined authority. So we have quite a large piece of our region that is widely connected to the Tees Valley region. So it's people transition between the two.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes sense. So one of the things that I wanted to just sort of move you on to was thinking about scale for a moment, because Sophie, the way you were describing it earlier, and it was great, you took us back to beer and cheese. But one of the things that strikes you about beer and cheese is they are manufactured at tremendously large scale in the UK, and it's a time-served industry, and so the economies of scale that they've created are they're proper economies, aren't they? What's the advantage from this cluster on the scale front? What do we get out of that of the two regions working together?
So I think scale's really scale's where things get tricky, is like when you're scaling technologies up, especially when they need to go from something that's looks really cool on a lab bench, but actually you need it in hundreds of thousands of tons. I think especially when you look at where our chemicals and materials industry is, that's a really important question, because we've had sort of these traditional chemical industries which provide huge value to UK PLC. They're the fundamental building blocks of our automotive industry, our aerospace industry, our defence industries. And at the moment, the economies of scale and the energy challenge around that and the carbon emissions around that are really threatening that industry at the moment. So I think one of the interesting things for the bioeconomy and for bioindustrial cluster north is how are we going to scale those technologies through in some of our materials, in some of the new materials, to that big industrial scale, and also in the time frame that we need. And that's what this is all about, really, is how can we pull through those technologies and get them manufactured at those big industrial scales quickly. I think one of the really good things about the hookup between Yorks and Tees is Tees has got that industrial heritage. It's got those industrial sites. We're used to operating these big manufacturing installations and getting them efficient, getting value out of them, and we can get them exported straight off the deep sea port there. And I think one of the amazing things that Yorks brings into that is the Bio-Yorkshire cluster that's already there. Some of the really cool technologies that are coming through from York University in that area. They've got a really strong green chemistry department. There's some really strong biotechnology components coming through. And they've also got some of that feedstock research and capability. I think when you look at some of the new investments in Tees, like, for example, the SAF projects that are coming on, I think they're really exciting. So if you think about where petrochemicals started, they started with digging kerosene, oil out the ground for kerosene, and then the chemicals industry evolved around that. And I think we're going to see that a lot. Is we're going to have a core product, which is that sustainable aviation fuel, but actually how are we going to use the residues and the feedstocks and the byproducts for other chemicals and materials? I think that's where we've got a real opportunity in bioindustrial cluster north, alongside some of the higher value stuff as well, some of the smaller volume stuff.
You've given us quite a good look there at the range of what the bioeconomy holds. What you were talking about there, and it's clear if you look at feedstocks, if you look at materials, if you look at chemicals, you bring in manufacturing capability, they all seem to have a role to play in engineering, in taking engineering biology and actually bringing it to business. What are some of the best examples you've got? So you've talked about SAF, sustainable aviation fuel. But between the two regions, what are the other promising areas that you both think are exemplars, if you like, of where the bioeconomy is going? So let's say we've talked about SAF, we talked a little bit about exotic as an example. What other ones have we got that we look at? We go, this is really intriguing.
The other one, go on. Go on, we're all jumping in. Go on, Tracey, you go first.
From a York and North Yorkshire perspective, we've got a centre of excellence for anaerobic digestion. So we're working with the water industry and looking at how we can use some of those residues from cleaning water with the likes of Yorkshire Water and other companies to look at how we can use those residues to turn them into other products and how we can extract chemicals as well from the waste residues from water filtration. So there's lots of interconnected businesses around anaerobic digestion, and also it has a role to play on farms as well. So it's how that impacts the wider economy within the York and the Yorkshire region.
Yeah. Sophie, how about you?
I think the other one for me, and a company that's been quite a strong advocate and supporter of the project and programme is Croda, and they make really nice sort of specialised ingredients, particularly for personal care products, and I think that's a really big opportunity for both the regions. Obviously, Croda are headquartered in York and North York, and they do a lot with different parts of the research and innovation ecosystem in York and North York, and they also use CPI for some of the sort of scale bits and bobs as well. And I just think I saw a presentation once, it was a while ago now, and it was how you could use lignocellulosic components from straw to provide kind of the gel matrices and air bubbles within our cosmetics, so that you get those really light, nice, smooth creamers that I use a lot of. And you're using those lignocellulosic materials instead of the petrochemical ones, which is really exciting.
And those are two really different ends of the scale, aren't they? There's a feedstock in terms of the waste is a feedstock everywhere has, and if you can find value in waste feedstocks, then you're really onto something. And I think Tracey, the point you're making is great. And then Sophie, the bit about, for me, the piece you're saying there about how you're using bio-based materials, if you like, in the products that we're buying in the shops. I think it's where you seem to bring engineering biology into the everyday, although people just don't realize it. But a little bit like, I think that most people have no real idea where chemicals fit in their lives. And here we are talking about how you replace the chemicals that people don't realize are in their lives with bio-based materials that, again, they might not realize are in their lives. And yet I think these materials go across all the sectors, if you like. If you industrial strategy sort of that the UK has, look, materials crosses across all the sectors of the industrial strategy. And I'm interested in how, as a cluster, you get the benefit of scale, but also the ability to deal with all of those sectors. And does it get, how do you keep it at a national, how do you keep it nationally significant, if I could put it like that? Because if I go and sit in London, or if I sit in East Anglia, or I sit in Warwick, they're going to talk to me about bio-innovation or things that they can do. How does this cluster work as a place, if you like, as a focal point for UK biomanufacturing? Sophia?
Yeah, I think the differentiator we've got is the history and capability we've got in the bioengineering piece, and that industrial heritage around really what it takes to manufacture some of this stuff. And I think the York and North Yorks brings in some of that agri expertise and capability as well, and matching those two things up together, I think, gives us a real USP versus some of the more high-tech clusters. I call them high-tech, but the London, the Cambridge, they're not they're not the places really. You're not going to build a big manufacturing plant in inner city Cambridge. So I think our cluster gives us that ability to do that whole supply chain through and out to export. I think if you look at where we sit nationally, we really strong. I think if I just look at teas, the jobs number in the bioscience industries, I think we've gone up 75% in the last 4 to 5 years. So we're a really fast growing cluster. And if you add in York and North Yorks as well, that gets even more impressive.
And Tracey, any thoughts from your end in that? Why is this relevant nationally?
I think it's relevant nationally because we've got a target for net zero. And net zero means that from a fossil fuel perspective, if we're no longer going to be producing oil ourselves, how do we then produce all of these critical chemicals that are in nearly every one of the products that we use every day? So with having a net zero policy for the UK, we have to have a solution, but it's also an opportunity. The opportunity for an alternative to fossil fuels is worth around $30 trillion worldwide by 2050. So it's an opportunity not just for UK sovereignty, it's an opportunity for global growth for UK products and industry. And also, we all know we live in a very volatile world at the moment. If we can no longer produce products that rely on fossil fuel industry supplying those into UK, how are we going to become resilient? How are we going to protect our jobs for the future? And how are we going to grow economically?
So that's great. We've talked about why it's nationally significant. We've talked about the ideas that are being generated in the region. We've talked about the scale-up capability of the region. We've talked about the industrial compatibility of the region. I wonder, when you think about companies that are then on the journey, that are going from idea towards business, where do they typically stall? Where's in your two's experiences, where do companies really struggle to follow this journey that we're talking about? And then I'm going to come on and ask you, so what can we do about it?
So it's interesting, actually. We did a little bit of work with a couple of different universities around where the sort of valley of death of technology development was really biting. And at the time we looked and we saw there was 2 sort of point failures in the system almost. One was just pre-incorporation. So technologies come out of a research lab and it's too early to spin out. But it's too late for research grants, and there are interventions in that space, but it's actually really difficult for the universities to fund that space well. There's not enough money going into that bit. And then post incorporation as well, we're seeing some of the mechanisms don't work for very, very small micro companies. So I think that was an interesting bit of work, and it was related to finance, but we also know that there's a really big gap at the late scale demonstration phase. So actually the technology looks really good. They've probably done the first sort of couple of phases of pilot work, but then actually they need to put a significant capital on the ground. And I think when we looked at the numbers, it was something like we had a decent amount of early stage investment and good UK venture capital going into seed funding. So there was about 57% UK funding in the seed rounds. But then that UK investment in Series A and late stage was dropping right down to about 10% by late stage, which meant foreign investors were crowding in to really good technologies, but it also meant that we were really at risk of losing some of these technologies overseas. So I think it's about that tolerance of risk and where we get the funding from, custom of the different stages of the development, with the funding and relating that to the skill sets of scale up is in my opinion where we need to consider as a UK how we connect it all together better.
Tracey, how do you think about what Sophie's saying there in terms of the access to finance? What might we do about it?
I think access to finance is a challenge. So I know that as Bioindustrial Cluster North, we're looking at presenting to investors our concept and looking at how we can get government and use some of the engineering biology funds to develop develop almost a platform to lift these businesses up and help them. Just in terms of some of the areas that Sophie was talking about, I've had experience in our region with a firm called Bioeconomy. So it was a glue being developed again. It had come from a university, it had gone through the BDC. And I think one of the things is it's not just seed funding, it's the regulatory hurdles. So Bioeconomy got, a lot of innovation awards, and also had got UKRI funding. But when you look at UKRI funding and what's needed and lab space, and also how lab space is rented, I mean, obviously you have to rent it for 6 months. You might only need it for 3 days to do some specific tests. And also the nature of the products meant that part of that testing had to be up in Aberdeen. So it'd come from Sheffield, it'd come up to York, the concept to come from Sheffield, it would come to York for the BDC, some trials and testing to meet those regulations, which are often based around fossil fuels and make it harder for bio-based products to meet the needs required. And then some of the testing had to be done up at Aberdeen because they were looking at MDF and using a glue to develop MDF, which is a huge market. So there's lots of challenges, I think, for the businesses. And also, I know when the EU looked at this, they said there was two very clear valleys of death. There's the just before growth, having trials, and then again, even in the EU, there's regulatory hurdles that were never developed for these types of products. So it makes it 2 or 3 times as difficult to get a product to market. And that takes time. And the more time it takes, the more money it costs.
And do you think in terms of the way in which the ecosystem needs to operate then, it's interesting the government created the Regulatory Innovation Office, didn't it, which is sort of alongside the engineering biology team in DSIT to try and almost create sandpits almost where you can get into some of the things you're talking about there, Tracey. How do we influence that though? So that's a sort of national desire. What does a cluster in the northeast of England bring to the party?
I think the regulatory hurdles are going to be quite broad brush around bio-based because, as we said, we're talking about a bioeconomy, an economy-wide range of products and skills. So that's going to. I know that from a alternative proteins perspective, they have developed a sandbox with Food Standards Agency, but there would likely be, and I'm not the expert in this, a requirement for a number of sandboxes for different types of technologies and processes to get them to market.
I think as well, we talk a lot about the sort of triple helix sort of device for fixing things. I think that's a really strong sort of guiding principle for me. So that partnership between public, private and academic, and we really need those sort of devices to lean into some of these regulatory challenges. I think we need industry in particular to be steering that regulatory conversation around that this works and this doesn't, and then sort of the best friends in our academic communities and in our public sector say, okay, well, what about that solution, and for that to be tested with industry. But it does need a really strong industry voice, and that needs to be coordinated and facilitated into those sort of central government bodies. I think in the health tech space, CPI did a lot of work around a programme called Health Trip, which looked to do exactly that, which was really convene the voice of industry and help present that into government in a way that government could actually act on it. So I think we need that a lot more, kind of convening devices which really present the sort of industry's view and industry's challenges in an effective way.
That's great, because I've heard people talk about, a cluster taking the friction out of, or reducing the friction. And I think what you're talking about there, where you're convening a single voice that's a much more powerful voice, that seems to me to be one of the ways you take some of the friction out of the system, because actually you've got the voices acting in harmony. One thing I think of, Sophie, when I think of the RNA Centre of Excellence is if you go back 5 years, RNA is perhaps an example of where engineering biology and the bioeconomy didn't really know in the beginning of 2000 that it was going to, in the beginning of 2020, that it was going to be called on it quite the way it was. But is that a reasonable example, do you think, of where a technology was basically fast tracked and overcame its regulatory hurdles that we've just been talking about?
Yeah, I think it overcame a lot of hurdles, didn't it? I think RNA is a brilliant example. I mean, it was a very live technology in our academic spheres, and people were aware of its potential, but it needed that focus, that commonality of purpose. I think that everybody had, and I think that focus and also obviously that structured injection of cash. And all the partners coming together to fix that major global challenge that we had, showed what can be done. Obviously, that was at a huge scale, but interesting. It's one of the examples that we've used and talked about as a consortium around. Well, do you know what? If you fix the purpose, so the purpose of this consortium is to get technologies out and into production, into commercialisation. And actually we pick the winners, because I think one of the things that the vaccine challenge did was it was fairly ruthless in terms of picking winners and which ones were going to get there in time. And then that injection of cash and everybody working towards that really clear common goal, I think it does show what can be achieved in a very short time. And I think we need to get much more like that as a UK ecosystem. We need to say that it's not good enough for us to just bumble along. Sort of, we get there when we get there with some of these technologies. We've got to put a bit of pace and a bit of focus. And I think picking the winners and being fairly ruthless about, you know what, this business could be really good, and packing the expertise and the finance around the winners is going to be really important over the next few years. And that is one of the purpose of this Bioindustrial Cluster North construct, is to bring all of that together and try to work out which technologies we think as a consortium are really going to win, and help to bring them the finance, help to bring them the expertise to get there quicker.
That's very compelling. Tracey, just moving on a bit, I mean, Sophie's, that compelling picture that Sophie's given of how success looks if the cluster is able to do what it does, is planning to do. What do the jobs look like that you're hoping to get from the bioeconomy in your region?
For our region, York and North Yorkshire, we intend to be at the research to stage 1 to 5 of TRLs. We don't have the industrial landscape of the teas works to regenerate, and I know that some of these things do have the ability to be able to drop into the previous chemical systems. So certainly we see ourselves as being the platform for driving the innovation through and bringing in those research and development jobs within our region. We do have some industrial sites down towards Selby, but certainly not of the industrial nature that a Tees Valley has or a Humber.
And how do we keep up then with the skills and the training that's needed? So I assume, Sophie, what you'd say if you got that question is at the other end of the scale, if you like, to what Tracey's just said in terms of the industry. But what's the way in which we make sure that the people of our regions are actually trained and have the right skills for what we're talking about?
I think that's a really good question. I think it's one we're all wrestling with a little bit at the moment, aren't we? I think, when I was sort of growing up, there was a really clear laid out skills pathway. You did your GCSEs and you did your A-levels and then you got your degree, and then you might do a PhD, or you'd get, and I think we're all seeing that career pathways just aren't going to work like that anymore. And I think the universities and our colleges have got a big task on their hands, really, to grapple with what the skills of the future are, and also to be reskilling people along their career journey. Because I think getting trained in one discipline and that being your discipline isn't going to be the model anymore. I think you might get a foundation in something, but then I think you can be continually learning. I think one of the things that we're talking a lot about in CPI is how does AI in engineering bio drop into scale up, and how can we use that and we're conscious that we need to upskill our workforce in areas like that, and how do we do that on the job? And I think there needs to be a lot more different entry points for people into the skills system. I think the universities do a great job of the sort of degree and the PhD level, but we're going to have to transform really how we think about career pathways. And the universities and our colleges are really on the front foot in terms of leading and driving that change, and how we're all going to find the workforce of the future for some of these things.
I think the industry, yes, from the industries of the past, it's going to be quite different, isn't it? I mean, we're talking about digital twins. You know, how do you factory trial? Well, perhaps you have a digital twin. You know, you look at modelling on a system. And so that requires lots of different skills. We're not just looking for people involved in process and manufacturing and on the manufacturing floor and the science end of it. We're looking at how AI and digital twins can almost model things. So it takes out some of the cost as well. It'll take out some of the cost and some of the process, because things are going to change so much in the next 10 years. I mean, certainly from an AI perspective, it will benefit from an engineering biology perspective, but I know we've been looking at our region, it could take out 10% of jobs, and it will take out a very sort of specific 10% of jobs. You know, it's the entry level jobs for, you know, university graduates and things like that. So we have a skills team, and I know that Tees Valley will also have a skills team that work with government to look at what the skills needs are for the future and to develop them for the focus areas within each of our regions.
And that's, I think, a really strong point there you make, which is the variety of jobs that are needed to make this industry become the sort of vibrant feature of the community and of the regions, because it isn't just, as you just said, it isn't just engineering biology. It touches so many things, doesn't it? And I wonder, does regional connectivity here, is that a strength from this point of view? If you're a skilled individual, is it an advantage to have an ecosystem and a cluster, or does it not matter?
Oh, I think it's absolutely critical that people are surrounded by a cluster, and the strength of that cluster, or strengthen that cluster by joining the two regions together, is absolutely essential. I think Tracey and I muse quite often about how half the staff in Tees Valley are going down to York for their jobs, and vice versa. You know, businesses and people don't see the boundaries when they're applying for jobs, and actually having a bigger macro cluster across the two regions is a massive draw, especially when I think the technology scale-up piece requires all those multidisciplinary skill sets, and therefore actually you need to draw people from manufacturing operations, from research, and also the commercial skill set, right, as well. That's the skill set that we quite often see missing in early stage businesses, is that sort of international business, where are my export markets type piece coming together. So I think when you get a job, you need to, when you're running a business, you need all those different skills. And then also when you're getting a job, you don't want to just have that one job available to you. You want to be able to move careers without having to uproot your kids and go halfway across the country to another region. So I think being part of a cluster is important for multiple reasons, really.
Well, we're fairly biased, aren't we, between us, the three of us? But it's a pretty nice region to live in. So if you can get the jobs you want to for your career, and it's all in the same region, I think there's a lot to go for there. It strikes me that we've talked a lot about skills. We've talked about what the bioeconomy is. We've touched a little bit on what makes a successful company, and we've talked a bit about finance in that, how you get from small scale all the way through to a business. Can we just think a little bit about investment, a little bit some more, and think about how are the ways in which the small amounts of government money that's around at the moment, what are the best ways to use it to de-risk growth? What are your thoughts, Tracey?
I know when we've discussed this in the past, we've been looking at unlocking investment from pension funds, which the government are looking at as part of the Mansion House debate, and how we can use pension fund money to drive UK growth and invest in some of our high growth businesses. Also, as well, from the other end of the finance market, I know that what Sophie alluded to earlier is that we're looking at an accelerator within our region. So looking at how an accelerator can draw businesses in and give them some of the support they need them to get to the first stage and help them unlock that growth potential that again benefits the UK.
Just briefly, how does an accelerator work? What would that mean for a small business?
I think I'll come in because I've been working a bit on this. So I think one of the things that we've been talking about a lot as a consortium is how do we make high intensity support to innovators real? So how do we pack around technologies that we think really, really do look good? How we combine expertise around that. So I think for us, we've developed a model where we want to search and select the best technologies from across the UK, bring them into the cluster to work with the universities, with the CPI, with the BDC, be quite rigorous around the techno-economic assessments on some of those, and be quite inject a bit of pace, I guess. So which ones of these really, really could get there in the next 5 years? You know, so we're not talking 15-year journeys anymore. We're talking like how can we get some of these through in 5 years, actually get the manufacturing in 5 years, which is super ambitious. But we think we might have developed a bit of a model around how we do that. And obviously the finance is a really big part of that. And the partners all have the capability of pursuing different public sector mechanisms to try to bring cash into that. And we also have CPI Enterprises and Pioneer Group that act as investors into businesses from a private finance point of view, and also Everquest Capital. We've also had some really good discussions around Aviva, and they're supporting one of our next events. So I think for me, you're absolutely right. Bringing that public and private investment together is really critical. And one of the things that we want to achieve in this bioindustrial cluster north is doing that in a much more organised and intentional way. And hopefully that will help us do that really fast sort of conversion of technology into manufacturing that we're trying to look for.
And is the crucial bit in that having the capability and the capacity to keep a company? You talked, Tracey, about the fact that if you needed a lab and you had to hire it for 6 months, if you only wanted it for 3 days, that's a problem. But hand in hand with that sort of acceleration and that availability, if you like, of how you might get to funds, you surely got to have alongside that assets that you can use, be they people, capacity, capability. They all seem to me to be part of the ingredients you need to make this region successful.
Yes, and certainly, as we talked in terms of the region's assets, from concept to, TRLs 1 to 4, probably the Biorenewables Development Centre would be able to help you develop your product. It's got some fantastically experienced chemists and green chemists that work in there, and they can help develop that first scale of your product up before transferring to CPI. CPI is when you then get past that TRL 5 and are looking to scale up. So we have assets in the region that people can use. They're open access. And, from a Biorenewables Development Centre, the team are expertly supportive there. We've had some really good feedback from all of the businesses that come from across the UK to interact there and do the first stages of their products. So I think that ecosystem we know is working. It's how to get, as Sophie said, more businesses through faster and getting them to scale and provide. And that's where the ecosystem comes in, not only just from developing new products, but as we were talking earlier, once you have a cluster, you have skills across that cluster and businesses can work together. And we find that a great deal in our area in terms of the amount of support that the bioindustrial cluster has received from the wider regions.
Oh, that's great. we talked about a national significance, and it sounds like what you're trying to do there is to really create something, the region to be a place, or the combined regions to be a place where people can come and take their journey from idea to business. Just wanted to think for a moment with you about why geopolitically, everybody, you turn the news on today, and the geopolitics of today are, you couldn't have written this a year and a half ago. I don't think. It's quite incredible what's happening. But it seems to have made chemicals and materials more in the public domain. They seem to be, people actually are starting to talk about, well, where do we get such and such a product from, or what's the supply chain for this or that, the other.
Yeah, I think it's something that's been highlighted as well, because we've had quite a few closures of some industries that were due to take over from some of the old ones, like the bio industries in terms of biofuels and things like that. So we have had some challenges. But again, I think there's been quite a lot of news lately as well about some critical chemicals looking as though they're not going to be produced in the UK. I think one of them that was flagged by Sky News was salt. And salt is critical, not just for salt in our foods, but salt is such a critical mineral that, once again, the UK looks as though it's no longer going to be producing. So I think it does seem to be breaking through into the news and into general awareness. But ultimately, there's all of the challenges around oil as well, isn't there? And oil, up until now, has driven the world's economy. So I think it's becoming more and more important that we need to focus on what's the alternative if we're no longer an oil producer, because otherwise we haven't got sovereignty or control over the prices of our products anymore.
That's a really key point, and I think it's sort of historically we've missed a bit of that point, haven't we? We've seen one chemical plant closure after another, and it's been like, oh, we'll just buy it in. But actually, we're increasing our carbon emissions when we do that, realistically, in real terms. And also, we probably can't make everything here, but we need to understand the impact on our critical supply chains. So we need to work out really, really what do we need to make here and make sure that that's protected. I think there is a little bit of dialogue in the industrial strategy about a sort of concerted effort to consider those supply chains, but it's really sorely needed. The HVMC has started out a little bit of work looking at the GVA impact and the sort of critical impacts on some of our supply chains. Just recently, we're about to publish that. I think it will come out later next month. But we need to pick and choose. If we want to be in defence and we want to be in aerospace, we want to be in automotive, for example, we need carbon fibre, right? But 75% of feedstocks for that carbon fibre are imported at the moment, and some of them come from places like China and Russia. And it's like, oh, are we happy with that, really? Particularly around the defence question at the moment. So I think we do need to understand really, really what we need to make here, and then we'll need to very aggressively guard those investments that are here and make sure that they're fit for the future.
Do you think manufacturing in the UK, we talk about advanced manufacturing or high value manufacturing, what's its importance to what you've just been talking about there, Sophie?
Oh, it's massive, isn't it? I mean, the alternative is you become a purely service economy, which then you're incredibly open to very volatile politics and global relations, as you've just said. I mean, in the industrial strategy, we just talked about that one sector, which was advanced manufacturing. I think it was 760,000 jobs and 82 billion GVA. And we'd just be saying goodbye to all of that if we said manufacturing wasn't important. And we're just opening our doors to being very, very, very sensitive to some of these geopolitical situations. And I think a better understanding of the criticality of some of those supply chains and which ones we really, really need to guard is really critical. I think the bioeconomy as well is a big part of the solution to some of this stuff, but it does need a little bit of time and a little bit of investment to get to where it needs to be.
Well, you've both given us a really good advert for what the bio-industrial cluster North brings to the table in terms of the ways in which the two regions work together and combine their natural skill sets in terms of the innovation and historical commitment, if you like, between the TRLs, the technology readiness levels, the early ones that Tracey was talking about, and then Sophie, what you've talked about in terms of getting real scale to happen as well, and how that keeps the sticky jobs in the UK by doing that, and brings real benefit to the regions by what we've done there. And in that story, it brings us to the end of this episode and also to the end of the Engineering Biology series. And I just want to thank you both for taking the time to share your picture of what engineering biology is doing and how the bioeconomy clusters are working, particularly Bioindustrial Cluster North. Across the series, we've explored engineering biology from discovery to delivery, and in this final episode, we've looked at how ecosystems like the Bioindustrial Cluster North turn innovation into growth, how they create jobs, skills, and industrial capability, and also show what's possible when systems are aligned and able to move at pace. So my thanks to Tracey Taylor Preston and to Sophie Walton for joining me, and thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about CPI and its role in engineering biology and the Bioindustrial Cluster North Partnership, then visit uk-cpi.com and let's innovate together.